welcome to Lock In Drop In. This is going to be a hopefully 4-part series that I'm going to be doing where we're going to talk about all things that are happening in VCT Lock In, because there is so much right now, so many games, and what we've had so far we have been blessed with because it's been insane. So how many games have we even had so far? We've had 8 games and I want to talk about all of them. So I guess let's not waste any time. Let's get into it. So Koi versus NRG was the first game that we got. And in this game, I predicted NRG to win, and that is who actually won. Shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but if you saw the beginning of the first map, you would maybe think that it is a bit of a surprise because NRG did not come out all guns blazing. And it was actually a really big surprise, I think, to see NRG pick Icebox as their map, because if you guys remember, Icebox was always a map that Optic kind of sucked at. And anytime they did find any success on that map was usually because Ye was holding down the fort while everybody else was dying and he could come in and clutch everything out. And they don't have Ye anymore. So that one guy who was making it possible for them to actually win anything no longer exists. So that was very surprising. NRG started on the defense. They were struggling a little bit. They weren't picking up very many first kills. They didn't have a ton of trade potential. Wolfen on the side of Koi was doing a really good job, which actually was a really big surprise because Wolfen's kind of new. He hasn't played in this environment before, so you never really know what to expect for a player and how they're going to show up in that environment. But he did a really, really good job. Now, I think part of this you could put down to the fact that because NRG weren't playing a Jet or just any duelist at all, they didn't have the same disengage potential in those first, those opening kills. So for somebody like Artis who was actually playing Sage, those sorts of things are a little bit harder. But if you turn things over onto the attack, it was a completely different story. The Crashies Victor synergy was insane. Som was playing out of his mind, and especially as somebody who, everybody's talking like, we love our streamer, like W streamer. Som does have some competitive experience, but this is a role swap for him nonetheless. Like he's always been a kind of like in that traditional flex position, whereas now coming in to fill the shoes of Marv, who is one of the best smokers of all time. And Som actually really showed up, I think. There were some great uses of utility. I think he did a great job of supporting plants that Artis was doing, for example, but also his mechanical ability too actually, I think, really showed up in a lot of those positions because you knew that in a gunfight he was going to be able to hold his own. I think outside of Wolfen, Trex is a player from Koi that you can give a lot of props to on Icebox, but to be honest, once you got into Haven, you could tell that Koi were scared of NRG. Like, they were really scared. They gave them a lot of space when they were on the defense and they tried to play for post plants instead. And they were like, okay, we're just going to back the hell out, let them have the space they want, then we'll come back in. But the problem is they oftentimes didn't have a lot of room to actually work with to come back in. So they'd either have to like feed themselves all through garage because CT was being held on like a seaside plant or something like that. And it just seemed really like they were scared. It felt like that NRG read into it really quickly and they were actually able to punish that like very soon. They would come in quite aggressively, punish people who were on the site. They knew that that space wasn't going, that Koi weren't going to make that attempt to take that space back. And so NRG could play as if they already had it. I think there was a lot of value for NRG from players like Crashies and Som. I think they influenced the position of the Koi players a lot. With Crashies, this was things like, his Hunter's Fury, which he used a couple times, but also like his drones, which he used to support Artis. And then on the side of Tom. But then on the side of Som, we're talking about things like punishing rotates, which he did really well. There were times in Garage where he did that. So it's not even just his utility, but it's about really understanding that space that Koi were trying to take. My MVP for this game had to be Crashies. I think his performance and his utility usage and everything was just really good. You could tell he felt very comfortable, and it really, you understand why he and Victor wanted to stay on the same team as each other going into partnerships, because the kind of synergy they had between each other was really evident in this game. The next game was DFM versus Giants, and I predicted Giants, and holy crap, Giants turned out to be the most disciplined team, most likely, maybe only challenged by DRX for this, of all the teams that we have seen so far. Not one single motherfucking time did Giants allow themselves to be baited into anything, baited into rotates, baited into peeking, baited into any kind of aggressive movement. They didn't get forced to do anything. They didn't overplay anything. They were regimented. And which I think is so interesting and so important, because one of the talking points that came up on the desk at the beginning of that game was about how this is essentially Rhyme's last chance to prove himself as an IGL and to really show what it is he can do. And if anything is going to set a good precedent for your capabilities in IGL, this game is absolutely it. They didn't overreact to any decision that DFM was making. Any rotates, for example, DFM could just go off and do, and Giants would be like, okay, cool, we're just going to wait, and we're going to ensure that we set ourselves up really well for a post plant, rather than just trying to rush in or make sure we beat them there or whatever it is. They were so sure of themselves. I think there were times where it was clear that DFM had some good ideas. For example, they had a few set plays on Haven, but they didn't necessarily have the finesse to actually make them work in the way that they wanted. So for example, there was this one play that they did a couple times, which is where they tried to open up a C site push with a Hunter's Fury down from, the bottom of C long, and they would send Soldam in, and he would just dash in, put the smokes down, and try and get that first blood off of the back of that. And the couple times I saw them do this, they actually failed to get that first blood. Soldam would be taken down, and then you've just got the rest of the team who have to try and go up C long. By this point, the defenders know what to expect and they can take that space on the site. And this must be a kind of frustrating thing for DFM, I think, because Soldam, obviously, as a player, is somebody who has seen a lot of reverence in the past. They call him the Korean tens, whatever it was that they said. So he's always been known for being this very, very mechanically gifted duelist player, but then he had a huge hiatus. So I think a lot of the thing for Soldam is like just getting back into the swing of actually playing that. And I'm sure it's very frustrating for them as a team to try and set up those plays and for them to not go in their favor when they know full well that they have the mechanical ability on the team to do it. Now, I don't think that means that DFM are bad. It just means, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to face because you have these set plays and you want to get that opening kill and it's not working. I think it also didn't help by the fact that DFM did not have a lot of dimension to the way that they were playing, in my opinion. They didn't play super defaulty and they didn't pull a lot of fakes. And the thing with them is that they didn't really make a lot of early rotates or anything like that. If they were rotating, it was typically a little later in the round, and you knew that, okay, that rotate was legit. So I think that started to become a bit more easy for Giants to read into as the as the rounds went on, because then you also have things like Cloud, who's able to use his recon darts, for example, which he did really well on the Haven game, to slow down those rotates and to slow down the opportunity that DFM would have to actually engage onto another site. And so that was something that was used really well against them and just slowed down what sort of unidimensional plan DFM had in a lot of cases. And even then, that's mostly focusing on DFM as an attacking team. When it came to their defense, you saw similar problems on both maps that were played. And that typically came down to the fact that if Giants didn't make a move fast enough, DFM would get very impatient and they would step in. They would peek, they would try to engage aggressively onto the attackers, and I'm a big proponent of the fact that you should never do that, or typically never do that. I don't think it usually ends well, because as the defender, you don't have to make that first move. And that was something that they got punished for a number of times. They had some good individual moments. I thought that Anthem had some really nice, times. I thought that Suggest actually had some good moments, even though I think overall he didn't come very high in the ranking of the players on the team. But I just don't think that any of their good moments were enough to overcome the super methodical style that Giants were actually playing with. If I had to pick an MVP for this game, it would probably be Cloud. I was impressed with most of the players on Giants, to be honest with you, but I think that Cloud's Sova utility really enabled a lot of the decisions that they were making and gave them a lot of information that they could make those decisions off. Okay, FPX versus K Corp. This is my first incorrect prediction because I predicted FPX for this game. And a lot of that prediction came down to the fact that I was a little concerned about these two behemoths of Scream and Navera going into this new team, which had kind of scraped together what French-speaking players they had. And that's not to suggest that the other three were bad or that I thought really low of them, but I thought that there would be a disparity in the experiences and the level of those players, and just the idea of like, okay, how well are they actually all going to play together as a team? And you could definitely see some of the flaws in K-Corp when they were playing. They certainly weren't a perfect team, but like, let's start with what happened on Lotus. I only got to see a bit of that map. There were moments where K-Corp managed to really successfully pressure FPX out of a site take, especially over on the seaside. But then there were also times where where K-Corp would just leave a site wide open and FPX could just like waltz on in. And FPX weren't afraid to use these like nifty little creative ballsy plays. For example, TZH's teleport in onto the spike inside a smoke on a friendly nanoswarm with a shorty so that he could like take down whoever ran into him. That's just not something people do, and that was something that worked out really well for FPX in that instance. And I feel like, you know, it's the sort of thing you're only going to get from certain teams, this being one of them. But I will say I actually saw more of Haven than I did of Lotus on this game, and on the side of FPX I was really impressed with YU's performance. Like, holy shit. Okay, so when a team comes in and they're like picking Chamber, and you know, they go for their Viper on Haven, which we know that this team like to do, but it's still like, you okay? It's sort of like, what are you doing? What's this about? No, I got it. I think we all got it. Like, as soon as we started seeing YU play that chamber and just the ease with which he was collecting kills, the way he was holding down a defense on the A side, even if it was just like him at the top of A long and he's got the trademark at the top of sewer, and they're not playing with like a more traditional sentinel like most teams are at the moment. Oh my god, that man was on. He popped off, and it looked so impressive. He looked so comfortable there. And actually compare that with some of the defensive setups that K-Corp were bringing out. I was actually a little more impressed with the way the FPX were doing that, because on K-Corp we would see, actually in a lot of cases, this sort of 1-3-1 defensive setup on Haven. Now, what's really popular at the moment with a lot of teams is kind of having a jet sova over towards the A side, and then, you know, a little bit more spread over to the other side. You might play with just a sentinel on the C side, or you might have a couple people floating in that area, Killjoy utility, wherever, whatever. Killjoy utility is going to be somewhere between C and B, right? But in this case, K-Corp would just typically have Scream over on the A side, and all they would have really is his knife to throw down A long to see if anybody was there. But it meant that it was a lot more of a passive kind of setup, which I don't think is super equipped for this kind of meta. And so I had a little, you know, question mark or two raised there. There were also a couple rounds where you would just see Scream constantly being left as the last man standing. And it did make me wonder, like, you know, Scream, obviously an incredible player from like an individual performance standpoint, but is there an element here where it's kind of hard for him to balance that with being the IGL? He's obviously IGLing in French for this team. You know, is he still kind of getting used to that? Now, I don't know. Don't have any like sight into the comms, but there just were a couple of like decisions like that, positional decisions, where I thought like, I don't think this is the best way you can set yourself up. So I think that's a big reason why K-Corp only managed to get 2 defensive rounds on Haven. So we obviously went into a third map, and that was Pearl. And I have to say, actually, I really liked the use of Harbor on Pearl, and I also wasn't surprised by it. So the reason being is, for the Blast Spike Nations event in October, Harbor had just come out. This was the first event where Harbor was being used. And Navira played Harbor on like everything for that. So even though Navira didn't play Harbor on this map, and that also wasn't like a serious competitive international event, I still already knew that for these two players, Scream and Navira, Harbor being used had piqued their interest. So it kind of doesn't surprise me that they've sort of been like, I see something here. Because in all the interviews that we had with them for that event, they were like, no, Harbor's really good. Harbor's good. Like, just saying, like, Harbor's really good. So to see that actually be brought, I was like, okay, I can see where this like line of thinking has come from. And I think it did like, you know, wonders for them. I love the way that the high tide gets used to kind of like cut through the 2 connectors. The area that I refer to as Wishbone on Pearl, I actually don't know what the official like callouts are for it, because I never remember this shit, but like where you have this bit that goes into like B connector and art. you know, using the high tide, not cascade, holy shit, to like go through there and actually cut off information and whatever, I think is like really good, especially when you consider the fact that FPX seemed to be struggling for a lot of information in that mid area. They didn't have a lot of intel about any rotates that K-Corp were making, or you know, any mid presence or whatever it is that they were doing, just because the fact that they didn't really have that kind of sentinel presence. For picking my MVP for this game, I mean, statistically I'd probably have to pick Shin, but the player that made me like, oh my god, the most was admittedly YU, and that a lot of that just came down to his chamber play on Haven. I know they didn't win, but that was the player I got the most excited about in this game. DRX versus BBL. I predicted DRX for this game, and is anyone surprised? Because holy shit, this team were clean. Oh my god. Okay, so DRX had, I think Pearl was their, yeah, Pearl was their first map. They had some really, really good setups. Every time they engaged onto the B site, it seemed to be through the same kind of method of action. They would go in with the same flash, the same Viper's wall. Buzz would always dash forward into elbow. They would always plant in the same position, which was not on either of the kind of like default spots. It was always the same. It was set up like to a T. And it was always good for strong post-plant positioning. And I think mentioning that Viper's wall, you know, you have to just talk about Mako as a whole, who was playing really, really well, but especially on those rounds where you would see him bring out a Viper's pit and then play inside it, was almost impossible to deal with for the enemy team. I just thought he was so well versed in what to do there, and very, very impressive. I think that BBL were quite ambitious with their Yoru pick. This is the first time that we did see Yoru get picked as that kind of like, you know, primary duelist choice for a team. And I think that a lot of that didn't necessarily come down to Kushner playing Yoru poorly, but more so that DRX were really well able to read into what he was doing. So every time he'd kind of send those gate crashes up through spawn and whatever, he seemed to always be caught out. And the problem that you then have there is that, like, DRX are getting all of this value from their jet in Buzz, and then your duelist, who is ostensibly meant to be the player who gets those opening engagements, is being shut down really early. So on Pearl, Buzz was actually 6-2 for first kills to first deaths, whereas Kushner was only 2-3. So I think that duelist difference was quite a prominent reason, even if it's not necessarily because Kushner was like bad. I think more impressive play came out from BBL when we got to their defense on Ascent. And there are a few reasons for this. I think partially because DRX weren't really watching their flanks enough. So I think when they made, like, for example, A-site rotates, they would leave mid very open, and that's a very vulnerable part of that map if you're going to be making that rotate. So I think sometimes there just wasn't some due diligence that was being done by DRX, which seems a little out of character, but, you know, it is what it is. But I think also the fact that BBL never really gave DRX any free space. When they were on their defense, they would kind of push up and be quite aggressive at certain points. So, you know, for example, whether that was pressuring mid or whether that was pressuring B main or whatever it may be, there was always that pressure. There was never any free space that was given. And what this oftentimes meant is that when DRX made a rotate in the mid round, for example, they were still having, you know, being met with a full site setup because they hadn't done anything with it yet. And then when you have utility coming in from players like Turco and Brave to slow down those rotates, it meant that DRX ended up having a lot more to deal with a much less time than they maybe would have liked. However, there is definitely a player that I need to say some wonderful things about, and that is RB. Oh my god, what a fucking king. Holy shit, 17-1 at the half on Haven? Absolutely insane. And it's like, one thing I'm really loving about Valorant right now is seeing these players who used to be insane Sentinel players actually get the opportunity to do that again. And RB is definitely one of those players. I think he absolutely popped the fuck off. There was a huge Killjoy diff, in my opinion. I think that DRX were really good at actually intuitively figuring out where Aslan's Killjoy utility would be. So for example, they would send like shock darts into Garage, where there would be a nanobot, and that would remove that. And so a lot of this utility was being removed for free, Whereas that wasn't actually happening in return. And that kind of meant that BBL were really struggling for information as to the whereabouts of DRX. And meanwhile, DRX they were capitalizing on the Killjoy util that they had, as well as just RB being a beast. I think even though DRX played well on Haven, I did have a couple of questions about their defensive positioning. And this is kind of similar to what it was with K-Corp. Because, so for example, we would see Buzz and Zest post themselves on Sewer quite a lot. And so Buzz would try and get that opening kill from Sewer, like peeking down into lobby. And he actually lost the number of those duels. And what that would do is just leave Zest like trapped in Sewer and just kind of on his own. And they got to a point where I was thinking like, please just like go to A-Long instead. There's an easier disengage potential for you there. It's, in my opinion, a little bit easier to like play around each other. I don't have a problem with players actually starting off in Sewer. I think it's a very pressurizing position, but when it stops working or isn't working for a number of times in a row, that's where you kind of got to be like, what do we gain from this? Let's try something else. And I think that more popular position for the Jet Sova of the top of A-Long is something that they could have benefited from. However, that alone is not enough for me to say that DRX played poorly, because they 100% didn't. They were absolutely insane. And my MVP for this game has to go to RB. Okay, Cloud9 versus PRX. This is the game that I was the most excited about. And I was so tired this day because I had stayed up really late the previous night and I just wanted to go to bed, but I knew that I had to stay up for it. I predicted Cloud9 for this game, and okay. Firstly, can we just fucking retire Chamber? Like, I know that it actually was a pretty cool pick for both of these teams, but I'm so excited to see Cloud9 play without Chamber that there's a part of me that's just like, come on, dude, I just want to see it. I just want to see it. But okay, let's start with Lotus, because Lotus was a really, really interesting map. I think the Sage pick from PRX was really, creative. I think it was really cool. They used it in a lot of cool ways, whether that was boosting Forsaken at the bottom of A main or A route, whatever you want to fucking call it, to try and get those opening kills onto somebody like Zelsis, for example, or whether it was actually using it in the C site. This is something they did at some point. They used it in the C site to sort of cut off access from Waterfall down into, like, let's say if you were going towards Mound. And so that meant that there was this one round where Zeppa was trying to come in and do a post plant, and there was no way for him to rotate around or get any flanks or whatever. He had to directly face where the plant had been done, which basically makes it impossible to retake the site. Didn't work all the time though, because there was that one round where they placed it in the B site to get that really tight little plant on B, not in the line of sight of any other entranceway, which everyone's like, oh my god, that's so freaking cool. But then it's like, okay, you got to back out for the post plant, you're getting smoked off, everyone's spamming into the spike, and they still fail to end it. They still fail to deny that retake, which, you know, great idea, poor execution. So it didn't always work out, but I did like the ideas that were coming from that Sage use. I think overall PRX were using a lot of that defensive playstyle that we've come to know and love from them, both on the attack and on the defense. So for example, on attack, they would have Forsaken on the chamber. He would be, you know, really hungry for those kills. But then someone like GenG, who's just gonna like blast pack into a side, gonna push with a showstopper all the way back into CT, apply insane pressure to try and lead the way for the rest of the team and give them the space that they need. These are really, really characteristic ways of playing for this team that we've come to know and love. On their defense, however, you know, they still played in that sort of like aggressive style, but I think that a lot of the times where they did come out on top were usually due to like mechanical skill and good reactions, and weren't necessarily due to having like a better coordination of utility or anything like that versus Cloud9. I think that's why they were a little bit more inconsistent there, because Cloud9 were very good at like swinging in unison and just moved like one cohesive unit rather than lots of individual parts. And so I think that made it a bit harder for PRX when they were on their defense. A lot of Cloud9's defensive setup was based around Zeppa and Celsius playing over on this A side and just really playing off each other's utility, like the flashes, the dog, the fast lane, whatever it may be, and make that really hard for PRX. However, one thing with Cloud9 is they were really intuitive about when to make rotates. So they didn't really hang around a lot. If they felt like they needed to go somewhere else, they would immediately go. So for example, on that A side, if they didn't have contact early on, they were rotating to C. So I think another team would maybe be able to exploit that and actually like bait them into doing that and maybe take advantage of some of that space. PRX weren't doing that. And so what it usually meant was that Cloud9 kind of had this upper hand when they were making those defensive rotations because they would always end up being in essentially the right place. It did help that a number of these rotations were really, really well supported by Zeppa particularly, and oftentimes using the Seekers to either apply pressure onto PRX, so whether that's like applying pressure through like a rotating door as they're trying to rotate somewhere else, or even just tell Cloud9, give them the confirmation of where PRX were. And the fact that Zeppa was playing out of his mind, he was farming those Seekers, dude. So he always had them available, and that was like massive for C9. That was just free util. When it got to Pearl, you know, Cloud9 were really, really clean, and I think this is such an exemplification of the confidence with which Cloud9 play and the confidence with which they are making their decisions. And you have to give so much credit to Vanity for this fact, because, for example, when they are pushing on their attack, they never really played super slow. They were it wasn't even super defaulty, you know. There wasn't this kind of unsureness. They made a decision, they stuck to it. And, you know, even going in with like this interesting choice of Zelsis being on the Phoenix and that being the duelist around which they were playing, still not getting to see any Yay Jet or anything like that. But it was it was working really well for them, and it meant also they weren't faffing around in mid that much. Like a lot of teams on their attack will spend a lot of time there, and that just wasn't really happening for Cloud9. But I think one player who really, really needs to be given credit for the way that they played on Pearl was Leaf. And, you know, sticking to that idea of the attack and what's happening in mid, Leaf would oftentimes just kind of place a turret in like B-Con or something like that, and then he would lurk in mid, and that in and of itself was enough for Cloud9 as far as their mid presence would go. But overall, I think his utility was just kind of insane on that map, you know, the way that he would set up for these B retakes and stuff like that, and it always seemed to work out really well for them. And also we have to mention, like, he's hitting some outlandish shots. I know that Forsaken would probably rather forget about the frenzy kill that he got onto him in mid when Forsaken's holding onto a bulldog, and Leaf evidently didn't know that he was there and still won that 1v1, but I don't want to forget about it because it was fucking insane. So I think Leaf did an insane job on that map, and for choosing an MVP, it would really have to come down to between Leaf and Zeppa, but I think I'd give the edge to Zeppa just because he seemed relentless across both maps in just pumping out constant value. All right, let's move on to Heretics versus Evil Geniuses, because this is the next game where I actually predicted incorrectly, because I predicted that Heretics were going to win this game. And in my defense, a lot of the reason why I did that was because I was not necessarily sure who EG were going to play. Like, I maybe it's just because I've missed information somewhere or whatever it is, but I didn't know who in EG was going to be put together, and the fact that you have so many players, I was like, oh my god, this is going to need like a complete re-synergization. I don't really know like where that's going to come from. And there were so many question marks around EG, and especially just with their sort of lackluster performance last year, I didn't want to predict them too highly, even if there were individually strong players on the team. However, I'm glad to be proven wrong, because the way they played this game was fucking sublime. So this was the second time we got to see Yoru on Pearl, and I mean, no offense to Kushina, but this is the way to do it. I thought that Ethan played a really beautiful Yoru, particularly his defensive positioning. For example, like on the cubby on B long, he would be ready for those like really early flashes so the rest of his team could play off of them. He'd be able to TP, get out, join position, you know, in the backside, wherever it may be. That was always really good. The way he used his dimensional drifts, not just for like recon, but to avoid trap wires, to be able to push up really aggressively on enemy players and like come out of the dimensional drift right next to them where they're maybe not anticipating it and just like just shoot them in the face. He did that in Beacon, he did that on CT, on the A side, and the kind of value that you get from that is you basically take this really necessary space for free without anyone in your team having to do anything particularly risky to try and get that space. And it was so good. It worked really well for them and derived so much value. I think Heretics had some really interesting ideas and some big successes on their attack. I mean, we have to talk about Kellogg's. And I was really excited to see Kellogg's play on LAN again, because I remember back at Masters Berlin, one of the big narratives surrounding G2 was that Kellogg's was this like kid who'd never played on LAN before, and he just was a LANimal like the second that he touched it. And so I was like, no, I believe in him. I believe that he can do that when he gets back. And it looked like that was going to be the way that it was. He went 20-6 on their first half, and he went 4-0 for opening kills to opening deaths. However, that didn't last. And I think this really highlighted a problem with Heretics, is that when Kellogg's stopped getting that like infinite potential, the rest of the team couldn't really make up for that. And I think that's really risky. You know, if you're relying on a star player to do things, ooh, I don't know how I feel about that. That's not a great position to be in. So it's sort of like, yes, let's celebrate how well he played on the first half, but also like the fact that he didn't on the second half, and that, you know, the enemy team were able to adapt and kind of bring that down. That needs to be looked at. I think they had some interesting ideas with some of their defensive setups. So for example, they would try to be quite flexible around where EG could make rotations within the mid sort of area. So they would maybe have a defender up in Wishbone, and but they wouldn't have anyone really like around kind of like B connector or whatever. And a lot of teams do that, you know, they leave that area open. But usually you see this on teams where they're playing a Killjoy and they'll place a turret in there. In this case, they were playing Cypher and they would have like a camera at the bottom of B connector and sort of have it like that. And it kind of made the whole area feel a little bit more open, because the thing is with a camera, while you can get your information, you can't immediately punish it like you can with a Killjoy. So that was kind of interesting, just seeing that play out. But I think ultimately, like, Heretics' B-site defenses didn't end up being as good as they should have been, especially not their retakes. They really struggled with their retakes, because even though in a number of cases they would actually get all the necessary kills that they needed to, you know, like hold a post plant, it would be too slow. Like, time would be not on their side. And you compare that to the B-site defenses that Evil Geniuses had, and it just felt like night and day. I mean, Boostio's value that he was giving with the way that he was defending the B site was just huge. You know, I just mentioned how a lot of Killjoy teams will play maybe with a turret in Beacon. He didn't even do that. He didn't even play with the turret at the end of Beacon. He would actually play with a turret up in heaven, which would directly watch onto Beacon. But what that kind of means is that if that catches anybody rotating through there, you have that immediate information that you can act off of without having to put any of your players in an unnecessarily risky position by having to actually swing into connector. You just have to hold really good positions in the backside of B. And that was something that worked out very well for Evil Geniuses, and was something that players like Ethan could play off of really well. I think one of the really nice feelings with Evil Geniuses is I got the sense that everybody was contributing equally. You know, obviously everybody has their moments where they play really well, but it just felt like everybody was doing their part. I mean, another player who I want to talk about is Com. Com had some really great moments on Pearl and on Ascent. He had these really like gutsy moments where he would play aggressively on like A main on Pearl, but then also know exactly when to retreat, exactly when he should be using his haunt, using his C's, and setting up the next person in his team. Then you look over on what he was doing on Ascent, and there were these gorgeous little set plays surrounding him. I mean, there were a lot of jokes about like the Odin Sova, but that's nothing new. But what was kind of new was like him playing Odin Sova on Cat rather than on B, and being able to get kills straight over into tiles, because that's not something that Heretics are going to be accounting for, like, whatsoever. And again, like, there were other set plays involving other players. Like, Boostio and Ethan had very intertwined responsibilities, because, for example, if Boostio was like setting up his Killjoy utility on the B side, he would have a turret in mid and Ethan would be elsewhere. He'd be over towards A. But if Boostio was setting up towards the A site, then you would have Ethan be playing in mid. And you'd see a lot of knives coming out like earlier. And so it wouldn't just be, it would be like a little bit more of an aggressive mid positioning or mid defense in a lot of cases. So there were all these like little, everyone's kind of, yeah, like intertwined. I also thought Boostio had some really good flanks, and you know, part of that comes down to the fact that Heretics weren't necessarily fully anticipating that or fully prepared for them, but he was able to like take pretty good space and come up around. And I think especially in situations where Heretics were slowed down on like engagements that they may want to take, if you can then get like, you know, they're waiting for their moment to actually make an engagement. If you then have someone coming behind and they pick off someone from your team, it's just another like thing that just grinds you down and makes it so much harder. And I think Mixwell was doing, he was working really hard to try and set up these sites, because oftentimes his initiative utility was used in the direction of where they planned to go. So you wouldn't really see him using it elsewhere on the map to like bait things or do other things. He was typically like very focused on setting up what the actual engagement was going to be. So, you know, they were working hard for stuff like that. You got like some little guy like coming up from behind, you just kill someone who's necessary to that. And that's really fucking annoying. But I think that overall, Heretics, they had some good plays, but their pressure that they applied almost always came from kills. Like it usually didn't come enough from other things they could do, and utility. I think their time management was poor. They like ran out of time a number of times, and I think there was a bit of a Sova diff because it just added so much for EG in Ascent particularly, and that just wasn't really the same for Boo, who I believe that's a role swap for him. So like, okay, but you know, it's still, you know, is there. For me, my MVP for this, again, this is one where I guess I could pick either Boostio or Com, but I'm gonna go with Boostio because I just think that like real consistency in it's almost like a silent consistency that came from him. I really liked. Okay, MiBR versus Talon, that's the next series. This is gonna be a really quick one because I basically missed all of this series because I had to do something. I predicted MiBR for this game. Didn't take a single map, but whatever. I found it really interesting that both teams decided that they were going to play Raze over Jet on Haven. You know, part of that might be like a comfort thing, but that's not really like in vogue right now. And I'm usually quite a Raze enjoyer. It was just, you know, interesting. I also found it interesting that even in like the opening like intro video thing about Talon, they literally said like, because of the absence of Patupan, like we're just using this game as a way to kind of induct our new players into this environment and help them get some experience. And they actually played pretty freaking well. I mean, I have to say, like, Garnets especially played really audaciously in a number of times where like MiBR would make these really pretty good, like, you know, site engagements. And Garnets is just like rolling up out a CT and like we get a couple kills, and I'm like, yes, let's go. You know, I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really good because I think it meant that my expectations for him were actually below the way that he did really perform. So because I didn't really see much of it, I have to give an MVP based off of what I did see. And in that case, it has to go to Cruz. Cruz, what? He just did everything, you know, like good Omen utility. He almost played Omen like an initiator so that he could like play off of his own util. But the man is crazy with a freaking rifle in his hand. And I mean, I know that the joke kind of leading up to that was that the teams were doing better on the non-rifle rounds, but like, whatever. Like, I thought Cruz did insane. I looked at the stats. It looked like he continued to play really, really well throughout the rest of the series. So whatever, he's getting my MVP. And then finally, Loud versus GenG. Again, I missed some of this series. I predicted Loud for this game. And I think you'd have to be kind of stupid. Actually, no, I say that because I'm pretty sure that Mitch said on the broadcast that he was concerned about Loud for this game because of the importance of those factors that they lost. And, you know, like Sassy and Pancada going to Sentinels. Yeah, that's huge. And also their coach. So yes, there have been like really important parts of the team taken out, but I felt like there was too much there for it to really go to shit. And also I think it's partially that like, I know a little bit less about the Pacific teams, so like players outside of, you know, the Pacific teams that have played internationally, I maybe know. So there's a bit of bias there, a little bit of bias there. But either way, I was very, very impressed and surprised at how competitive this series was. Like, I think I tweeted afterwards being like, Loud deserved the win, but the people deserved a third map. And it's true, they fucking did. This was another example of Harbor being used on Pearl. I thought that they used him really interestingly. They combined his high tides with Viper Walls. So, for example, to really dissect the B site and isolate the back site and up in elbow and stuff like that, I thought was quite creative. And they also did a similar thing, you know, to how K-Corp were playing it, where they would like cut the high tide through Beacon round, like through Wishbone into Fountain, and then through like art. So it's just very, very hard as defenders to be able to have any kind of robust information there or be able to punish any of the attackers who use that space for themselves. I think that Sudhack had some insane clutches throughout this game. I mean, the one that like comes to mind is his 1 versus 2 for like a post plant on the B side, and he gets his kill onto King with, I think it was a shorty. Like, he had an operator and a shorty, gets his kill in elbow onto King with the shorty, picks up the Phantom, and then gets the, you know, the kill to deny the post plant to Meteor. And it's just like beautiful, and it's just like, how is this man real? Like, how are these people real? I didn't really see anything from Fracture. I had the game on, but at this point I was so tired that I was sort of zoned out. I did like look through the stats again afterwards, but that's a map that I'll really have to rewatch. But I was really impressed with both teams overall. I thought that ultimately the game was really entertaining. And my MVP, and part of this comes from the fact that, you know, I only saw some of the series, I actually kind of want to give it to King, because even though GenG didn't win, this is another instance where there was a player who just gave such consistent value and performed really, really well, because actually the players that were doing the best for Loud changed with each map. And I just felt like King was so, so good. It's another one of those players who's, you know, like played on Killjoy before and now can come back to it. And I find it interesting how so much of my focus has been on a lot of these Sentinel players. Because you can just see the difference it makes to have like a traditional Sentinel on your team versus the whole fucking like chamber pseudo Sentinel shite that we've had for so long. But I thought King did really well. And yeah, it was great. So yes, those are the games that we have seen so far. I'm really curious on you guys' thoughts. Were there any games that like really surprised you, or outcomes that surprised you? I would imagine that Talon versus MiBR is probably the most surprising of the outcomes that I've seen so far. But to be honest, like, I just think it's been crazy how good the games have been thus far. Because this is essentially a glorified show match. You know, I didn't really know what to expect in terms of how much people are hiding. And I'm sure there is a lot that these teams are still hiding. But really, for quality of games, quality of competition, it has been insane. And I have been having the time of my freaking life. And I'm just really sad that some of these, like, I'm so sad about the single limb, because some of these games deserve to happen a second time. I think the game that I'm the most looking forward to out of like this part of the bracket that will continue after this is probably DRX versus Cloud9, because both of those teams just played in such a sublime manner that is going to be insane. But yeah, let me know what you guys' opinions are, and I will see you in the next episode of Lock In Drop In, which will be after the next bunch of games have been done. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.